Welcome to episode 140, would you believe, of A Pint with Seaniebee. Many thanks to all of those people who continue to sponsor the show on Patreon. It is funded by you, the listener. It's not too late to go to www.patreon.com/Seaniebee and subscribe for a couple of bucks a month. That's all I ask to keep the podcast up and going. Okay, this podcast today is probably the most controversial guest I've had on the show. So there's a trigger warning built in. Some people don't like talking about the sort of stuff we're going to be talking about today. This podcast is coming out a week after one of the most horrific cases in a long time in Ireland drew to a close with the sentencing of two young boys to long spells in prison for the brutal murder of a young girl by the name of Anna Craigel. These kids killed her when they were 13, and society finds it extremely difficult to come to terms with killers so young. The case threw up an awful lot of disturbing issues relating to misogyny at that young age in boys, entitlement, sexualization of young girls, pornography readily accessible on phones that caused these kids to somehow think they could do the atrocious things they did to this beautiful, vibrant girl who is now no longer with us. And society doesn't like when this happens. There's almost a religious element to it where people believe it is evil, and anything that is evil is best not discussed and not opened up and not analysed in the hope that it will never happen again. We hope we will always remember the beautiful pictures of Anna Craigel and keep in our hearts that our parents have to continue now living on without her. In 1993 in Liverpool, a young toddler by the name of James Patrick Bulger was brutally killed by two 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables. It is a case that has similarly tortured Britain ever since. Thompson and Venables were charged with Bulger's abduction and murder. They were sentenced to long spells in prison. They were paroled in 2010. One of the boys, Venables, John Venables, has been back in and out of prison, most recently 2 years ago, for possession of child abuse images on his computer. And the case has prompted widespread debate on how the issue of handling young offenders when they're sentenced, how that all works. My guest this week is Vincent Lambe, a filmmaker who made a short drama film in late 2018 surrounding the James Bulger case. The film got nominated for an Oscar earlier this year, and a huge Ferrari opened up, primarily around the fact that Vincent, the director, had not contacted James Bulger's mother to let her know that this movie was being made. The movie itself is called Detainment. I have seen it as part of my research for interviewing Vincent. Interestingly, an awful lot of people who panned, and there was a 250,000 signature petition to the Oscars asking for it to be removed from competition, I suspect hadn't seen it. There was a lot of bin lidding by the primarily tabloid press and tabloid television, where if you go on YouTube, you'll see Vincent trying to give his side of the story, but in many, many examples just getting shouted over with the outrage that he would ever go and make such a film. Here I hope he gets time to breathe and give his side of the story. It's suspiciously worrying as well that some of the more high-quality newspapers, when they did see his film, when they did interview him, were muzzled by editors for fear of upsetting readership. And we've got to remember that's how newspapers work. At the end of the day, they're there to sell things onto which they can put advertising, and they don't like causing controversy. The movie itself is extremely powerful. It is a true story. It is basically a movie that looks at what happened in the immediate aftermath of Thompson and Venables being arrested. It centres around two young boys getting grilled by police officers as to why they did it and how it happened. Pointedly, there is no violence in the movie. There is no reenactment of the murder. Many of these were claimed at the time to be in the film. They're not in the film. And the film makes you think. It makes you think how young people today, or even back then, could get to a point where they could commit such heinous crimes against other members, younger, vulnerable members of society. And we need to, in my view, keep having those conversations. Vincent Lambe has been through the ringer on this. He has become very famous, as is the movie for it, which he admits. I think in hindsight, he has a lot of remorse, which you will hear, and no animosity towards the Bulger family. And I think he tries to set the record straight in our interview. As I said, some people don't like listening to things like this, so if you don't, then it is time to switch off. But I think conversations like these are important, and we will always remember James Patrick Bulger and Anna Craigle, I hope, in our hearts, as people who have suffered unnecessarily at the hands of perhaps flaws in our society. So, I give you Vincent Lambe. Okay, so that was a background to Oscar-nominated movie Detainment. I have the director, Vincent Lambe, with me. Thank you for coming on my podcast. How are you, buddy?
I'm good. Nice to meet you, Sean.
So let's wade into it. What are we now? 6 months after the controversy that came up around this film. Talk to me about how that looks from this juncture back, from your point of view as the director.
Well, nothing really can prepare you for, 250,000 people hating you.
Baying for your blood.
Yeah, and pretty much all of them just hadn't seen the film, and they had a different film in their head. They would have read, a tabloid article or something, and there was so much misinformation that went out about the film. I think people thought that there was graphic violence in it, or that it reenacted the murder somehow. And it doesn't do that, and...
What is the message in your film? Because I watched it this morning, and I didn't feel it was controversial. We'll talk about the elephant in the room, which is that you didn't contact James Bulger's mother. But what was the message that this movie is sending out?
So, I would say that it shows John Venables and Robert Thompson for the first time ever as two 10-year-old boys, and not these evil monsters that are in people's imagination, But that's still the popular opinion. People couldn't really cope with the idea that these were two 10-year-old boys that had done it, and the only way they could make sense of it was if they were evil. So now the popular opinion is that those two boys were simply evil, and anybody who tries to understand them or says anything other than they were evil gets attacked for it. You get attacked for being too sympathetic to the boys. If you just dismiss children as being evil, it's very likely that something like this will happen again, because the only way you can prevent it is if you understand the cause of it. I think the first step is to acknowledge that they were human beings and children, so it shows them as they were. And
I also got this other element to it, which I don't think came out, is that they also had parents who had to come into those meetings with the police. Finding out that your 10-year-old has killed a baby can't be anything but horrific.
Yeah, that was one of the things, when I read it that stood out. There's this kind of idea that, that it's wrong to acknowledge the pain of the killers' families. I think that's a very archaic way of looking at things. I started to see this as a tragedy, not just for one family, but for three families. That's not a popular opinion to have. The first person to say it was David James Smith, who wrote the book on the case The Sleep of Reason. He met with the families and all the detectives, worked very closely with the police. It's the most comprehensive record of what happened, and it tells it accurately and honestly. And David has become a really great friend of mine now, since he's a big supporter of the film. And it's great, he's introduced me to people involved in the case. There's Malcolm Stevens, who knew and worked with John Venables. Malcolm basically oversaw the whole detention and rehabilitation of John Venables and Robert Thompson. So he watched them grow up, and he called me after he saw the film, and he said, Vincent, there's nobody on the planet that knows those two boys better than he does. He said the film does what he never thought was possible, that it accurately shows who these two boys were. And it was the most amazing compliment I could ever have imagined, or endorsement of the film.
Why do you think they did it?
I don't believe that anyone is just born evil. You know, I don't think you're going to find the answer in the Bible, but I think if you look into their backgrounds, you'll get a much better idea of what could have led two 10-year-olds to do this. So look at Robert's family first. The mother was beaten mercilessly by the father. The father left the family home when Robert was 5. The mother couldn't really cope. She tried to commit suicide with pill overdoses twice. That didn't work. So then she resorted to alcohol as a means of escape. She'd spend all her time down in the pub. As a result, the whole Thompson household was bedlam. It was 6 boys. The oldest would beat up the younger one. If Robert was beaten up by his older brother, he would take it out on his younger siblings. Little Ben, who was only 3 years old, around the age of James Bulger. So when they're in the shopping centre that day, Robert says, "Let's get a kid. I haven't hit one in ages." And that's where it stems from. He had this kind of tough guy persona, which he created for himself, and he felt like he had to live up to that. But John was different in many ways. You know, John was weak but desperate to impress his tough friend, Robert. He didn't want to look weak in front of Robert. And that's what propelled it, that's what moved it on. And psychologists use this as a case study because they see the same toxic relationship happen again and again, not always with the same results. But it's that dynamic between the two boys which caused it to happen. It wasn't just their backgrounds. You know, if John had been stronger, then maybe it wouldn't have happened. You know, and if
I actually was of the opinion that it was going to be more a little bit about borderline police coercion to try and get sentences out. The police were behaving perfectly normally and ethically, as far as I can see. In your movie, you know,
really, the police dealt with those two boys with such care. You know, before, during, and after the interviews, and I really admire how they dealt with it. They were so gentle when they questioned the boys, and it was something that hadn't been done before. The detectives, would have been experienced in interviewing children, but they would always be interviewing children as victims, or maybe witnesses, but never perpetrators. Yeah, so it was very interesting. Yeah,
and I mean the performances from the two boys was spellbinding. I mean, I don't know how. I mean that it was just. Particularly John, when he was crying for his mum, and the way the two of them, you suddenly see they're 10. You know, you suddenly see these are little kids.
Yeah.
And I suppose for the police as well, as you said, like, I don't even know as a cop how I'd be able to get, like, I would not be able to believe that this was possible for these two lads to be thinking that someone else came along or someone, and it scared nation. Have you had any feedback from those two families?
From the Venables and Thompson families? No.
Because I know they haven't really been rehabilitated, right? There's been problems since they got out of prison, one of them, I think, right?
Well, yeah, John is back in prison for another offence, and there's very little sympathy for John.
Thing going on
as
well.
It was possession of child pornography, and it's the second time he's offended, so he's got 2 convictions for that now. I've talked to people who knew them. I'm talking to Malcolm Stevens, was very interesting about watching them grow up. Well, one thing he said was that neither of them could ride a bike, and he said Robert was given a bike for his 12th birthday when he was in his secure unit, and they had to put stabilizers on it. It just struck me as something which was interesting, which stood out, at 12 years old, that they couldn't ride a bike.
What was their incarceration like? Were they in a special prison, or how were they? How did they grow up?
They're called secure units in the UK, and they're actually looked after very well. And one of the main criticisms that I know Denise Fergus has always said is that she feels like they were given too good an upbringing, that they had a better upbringing than a lot of children in Liverpool,
right?
Because they were allowed to decorate their own rooms and stuff, but they were taken away from their families, from their parents. To go through a door, they'd have to wait for one door to be locked behind them and then go through another. I mean, anybody who says that isn't punishment, I would say, why don't you do it? No, they were in different places.
Have they ever contacted each other since that you know of? Or
no, they haven't. No, I talked to Malcolm about this.
And do they still?
They've never,
question each other's stories, or did that all sort of resolve?
So it took years of therapy before Robert admitted having anything to do with the murder, the crime. I mean, he had always said he put all the blame on John. he admitted to being there, but he said, it was John who did the attack. Through years of therapy, he eventually admitted his own part in the crime. And there was a Channel 5 documentary there this year. It played, parts of his parole statement before he was released, and he acknowledged it, and it was very interesting to see, how he had changed from age 10 to age 18 when he was being released.
How did you feel what sort of a person did you feel you were listening to when you heard him? That must have been kind of
parole.
Weird. Yeah,
his
the parole.
Yeah. I felt like he had acknowledged what he had done and did feel remorse at that stage, but that was only very recently, when that came out. I mean, I had made the film before I'd seen that and read his, what he says in his parole hearing was that he felt that, there was no way he could get through to the family of James Bulger, that they would always think he's just saying this because it's the right thing to say or something, or but that they would never take
sincere.
It sincerely,
Let's talk about the main criticism that you received for not contacting James's mother.
Yeah.
Give me your thinking behind that now.
So,
This.
I thought for a long time, about how to go about making this film. I was 12 when it happened. I grew up hearing about it. It was a huge story at the time. You couldn't have missed it. I was always told at the time, well, they were evil and that's why they did it. And then when I was older, I wanted to look into it more. I wanted to know how 2 10-year-old boys could kill a toddler. And that's what started me, reading about it. It started with one book. It started with David James Smith's book, The Sleep of Reason, which is an incredible book. I read Ralph Bulger's book and Denise Fergus's book, and they're heartbreaking, and I've always had so much sympathy for the Bulger family. So it's very hard when I hear people say, that I don't empathize with them because I've made this film. I do, and I always have, always will. But I also saw something else. That there was a human story beneath all of this, and these were boys and not these evil monsters that are, in people's heads. And I couldn't get it out of my head. After I had read the transcripts, I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I was like, wow, there's this whole story that people don't know about and isn't being told.
Did you know then, so now it's starting to germinate as I'm going to make a film. So have you have a film background, or was it, had you made other movies? I studied film. I've been making films since I was like 10 years old or something. I mean, my first films, I would cast my parents in them and shoot them on Super 8mm. Yeah. God bless them, they did it, I thought I was making a masterpiece at the time. They knew it was going to be terrible, but they did it anyway. I mean, I started doing drama classes, but the only reason I did it was to get actors to work for free in my terrible short films. And then I won an award for one of them when I was a teenager at the Fresh Film Festival, which is brilliant, and it's still running. Lovely awards that they made.
Yeah, and it's a great thing. It's like for young filmmakers. I think it's for under 18s. I remember just how encouraging that was at the time, that, to have your work screened and to get recognition for something you've made is a really great feeling, and it's so important, I think, for young filmmakers, to encourage them then, because it made me want to keep making films and make more films. And then I studied film in the National Film School now in Dún Laoghaire. After that, I realised it's actually incredibly difficult to get paid to direct. And you come out into the world and, before this, you have all these ideas about what you're going to do, and then it's suddenly really hard. I moved into producing, freelance producing. I worked with T.G. Cahir for a few years. I was producing music videos for Irish bands commissioned by Sony Music, Universal Music. But that doesn't really pay the bills, It was big gaps between jobs. I was like, well, what else am I good at? And I always loved casting. I was casting a lot of shorts in film school, then started working as an agent for child actors now. So over the course of maybe the last 14 years, I've held, thousands of auditions, a lot of them with children. And I found it's great practice as a director. It's a great way of finding out what works and what doesn't work, and to discover effective ways of directing child actors. So then, after I had read those transcripts of Detainment, I was always imagining how that would be done as a film, because child actors are incredible, but I think what was being written for them I think they're more capable than what was being written for them.
It's an extremely challenging acting task for those two boys.
Those two roles, I don't think I've seen child performances at that level before. Eli Solon, who plays John, and Leon Hughes, who plays Robert, and they're just both, incredibly talented actors. They're extraordinary.
I mean, that's actually that's one of the most disarming things about the film, because it's straight. You start thinking it's a documentary. To me, it's so well done. It feels like that they are actually the guys.
Like you're in the room, and like one of the people ask me, why did I make it as a drama if it's entirely factual? And it is entirely factual. It's a true story, as opposed to being based on a true story. Everything in the film is entirely factual. There's no embellishments whatsoever. So the reason I wanted to make it as a drama and not a documentary is because you can do something different with a drama that you can't do with a documentary. You can put the viewer in the room where they feel every moment, every feeling, as if it was their own. And I think it helps a viewer see something from a different perspective.
Did you know, though, that you were playing with something that was going to be sensitive and difficult for you to get off the ground and get made, or was this
of course.
We were starting this conversation about when you got to the point where you were about to make it, and this whole thing about you didn't contact anybody from the Bulger side. Was that deliberate, or how to, let's hear your side of this story, because it is the thing.
I knew that it was an enormously sensitive case, and I was always very aware of the great private pain that the family have, but there's also this enormous public interest. I wanted to make a film which showed a balanced view and an impartial film, and I was always trying to think of the right way to go about doing it. And I thought so long about getting in touch with the family, the Bulger family. I figured they wouldn't have wanted a film like this to be made, but if they did give permission, there would have been enormous pressure to tell the story the way they wanted it to be told. And then you're telling a version of the truth. I felt it wouldn't change what would be in the transcripts, but it would most likely change what would end up in the film. And it wouldn't be an impartial film. You're telling it from one point of view again. And, everybody sees this case through the eyes of the Bulger family, of course, but I think there's more than one perspective. And if you're going to talk to one family, I think you should talk to all three families. So,
what about the thought that you could have done that?
Well, I mean, there's still no way of getting in touch with the Venables family and the Thompson family. But even if we did,
I mean, they can't stop you making it. So it wouldn't
have. I mean, the transcripts were there.
Yeah.
So talking to the families isn't going to change what's in those transcripts. So instead, I decided, to make everything entirely factual. I took those transcripts like a Bible. The film is almost entirely verbatim. There's only a few scenes which happen outside of the interviews, which we didn't have transcripts for. So in terms of permission, I mean, I didn't ask for permission for that reason. But then I also thought about just getting in touch with the family and to let them know this was happening, and that was always my intention. I wanted to get a UK broadcaster for the film first. And then I would have let the family know that this is coming up, once we had a date. But I didn't want people to be given an opinion about the film before they had seen it. And that was always my worry, that, if we got in touch with them too soon, it would become a tabloid story. And people would be told, this is a terrible film before they had seen it. And now that's what's happened anyway.
I was going to
say that.
Because
the Oscar nomination kind of messed all of that up. Because people just started hearing about the film much sooner than I had intended for them to hear about it. It was only 6 months from the first film festival screening when it was nominated for an Oscar, which is very rare. It's nearly unheard of. The other films which were nominated had been screening at festivals for 18 months, up to 2 years, and then they do their Academy run. So everything just happened so quickly. And if I had known it was going to be nominated for an Oscar, I think I would have got in touch with the family to let them know. I wouldn't have wanted them to hear about it like that.
So one little segue here, because I was talking with someone about this last night, because I was actually trying to work out how to do this interview with you today, and I said to someone, Making of a Murderer, okay, blockbuster Netflix show, 2 parts, or maybe 3 parts now, I think. There's a victim who's been brutally, sexually beaten to death in that series. Is it common practice for for those producers to go and say to this family that, by the way, because they were actually saying their point of view was, your man did it, Stephen, whatever his name is, he did it, he's been put away, closure. And now it's all opening up again. And one of the biggest genres is crime and murdering and all this. And every knife has a victim at the end of it. So I was trying to get my head around it. Was it
in that
soon,
case, the Holbach family, they're not happy with making a murderer either. They strongly believe that Stephen Avery was the killer. Still, I think it was responsibly made as well.
Yes.
But I think if you are telling a true story, it does come with huge responsibility.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that anyone should be allowed to make anything any way they like it, and you should ensure that you're telling the truth if you're going to tell a story about a true crime or a family. Or
my point is that it's like this sort of genre is everywhere. I mean, it's not just like you're the first guy to come up with here's a reenactment of testimony that criminals gave in a police station. Okay, in this case they're very young criminals, which is maybe an issue, but it is everywhere, right? There's guys on death row who committed things or they're innocent.
Yeah,
it's not a new thing.
Part of the debate, surrounding the controversy was who has the right to tell true stories, and where do you draw the line? That they were saying certain stories shouldn't be told was the argument. That was the reason why people wanted it to be removed from the Oscar shortlist. Like 250,000 people signed a petition to have it removed. And, the Academy said to me, they said they're not asking for this to be removed for any eligibility requirements. They want it removed because they're saying that certain stories shouldn't be told, and they said that goes against everything that they stand for. It's
like witchcraft or something. There's a religion kind of thing going on.
I wouldn't say there's a line. I think if you draw a line and say, well, these stories can be told and these ones can't, somebody else will draw another line.
I know.
So, I would say there shouldn't be any line, but there should, be responsibility. And if you're making a film like that, you should make it in a responsible way, I would say.
I'm hearing in hindsight you would have contacted her. Am I hearing that right? In hindsight?
So, I never wanted the family to, find out about it this way. My plan was to always get in touch with the family, but I wanted to make sure people would be able to see the film. I didn't ever want it to be a situation where, people will form an opinion and then not want to see the film. And that's now exactly what's happened. So it's confirmed my decision. Yeah. Because I think if we had got in touch with the family too soon and let them know about it, it would have been front page of the Daily Star, the Sun, the Mirror. And people would be told what to think of this case. And then it would probably be hard to even get it into film festivals.
Right.
There was one festival in the UK, they got so much hate mail, people saying they're going to boycott the festival if they showed the film. They ended up dropping it. That's probably what would have happened if we got in touch too soon. I know it seems insensitive not to contact the family, but I couldn't see any other way of doing it. I wanted people to see the film, for it to go out on a UK television station and then talk about it. And then I knew there was always going to be a backlash, but there would be no question of what's in the film and what's not in the film. Whereas now the tabloids have written things about the film which simply aren't true. People have read these articles, they're reading it and they're believing it and they're outraged because of it. But I would be too if I was believing that. So I understand why they're outraged.
This morning, I watched the movie and I was slightly in trepidation about it, and I came out the other end very unnerved, very upset, very, that's why I asked you at the top of this podcast, what was your intention? To me, I came away going, I still don't know how those two boys did this, and I it's not that I had sympathy, I just went, how the hell did that happen? And the whole world doesn't want. Sometimes when we see something horrific, we want to actually bury it, and we don't. We said this actually, almost like this never happened. Humankind or unkind is not like this, and so do not dig it up again and keep it buried. And there is a slightly religious connotation to that. There's a slightly satanic kind of weird. Some of the great documentary about the three boys up in the south of America
west of Memphis.
Those Memphis Three, and that was just mayhem. Not true either, But that's the other sort of thing. I can imagine people going, don't go near that because that's all sort of the devil's work or whatever. So that's what I took out of it. I thought it was a very powerful movie. Were you surprised that it got nominated for an Oscar?
Well, I think the most surprising thing was when it made the shortlist of 10 films. I really didn't think we were going to make it, because I just figured, people hadn't been hearing enough about the film. It hadn't, screened at, the same festivals, a lot of the other films had, like, Fauve had won at Sundance, for example. I didn't know people were watching it, even like Academy voters, because they don't actually have to watch everything on,
I know, yeah.
on the
50%, right?
Yeah. The way they do it, I think they do rotate. Everything gets watched, but, every voter doesn't have to watch
everything, yeah.
Everything. So, when we made the shortlist, that was probably the most surprising thing. That took my breath away.
You're my second Irish Oscar-nominated short filmmaker, Michael Cray from The Crush on my show before. The hoopla then starts coming in on top of you, does it? The excitement of having to go to the Oscars. And what was all that like?
Oh, well, to be honest, people say to me, like, oh, you were nominated for an Oscar, that must have been great. But it was also the most stressful time of my life.
Talk to me about that. Did you get into you were a hated figure.
It was after we made the shortlist, I had started doing interviews and on TV, and I didn't actually feel like we needed to, because I was like, well, we've made the shortlist now, so voters will watch it. They have to watch the 10, so I kind of felt like maybe we don't need to do this, but my publicist checked in with Good Morning Britain. They said, oh, tell them not to worry, we're just going to be talking about the film and we won't be doing anything negative. You've seen the Good Morning Britain interview.
So you're hijacked. Yeah.
And it was a full-on attack.
But you were not expecting this.
They were asking questions. They barely let me answer. But they also framed it in a way, where you can tell people, how to think about something. If you compare that to the Sky News interview that I did, a few weeks previously, where Gamal handled it in a a very delicate way as well, but wasn't telling people what to think, how to think, So after that interview, all hell broke loose. When I got back to my hotel, within that time, the Liverpool A Co had already published an article online, which they had ready to go, but they were waiting for the Good Morning Britain interview to happen. So this was published, and they had one of the detectives involved in the case came out strongly, against the film, but he hadn't seen the film at the time. He was basing it on a clip that he saw, I think, on Good Morning Britain. So he said I would question the accuracy of the film, which gives the tabloids, just enough to say the film is inaccurate. And that's what it became, So, but I've huge respect, for the detective who said that. Albert Kirby is his name. I'd always watched his interviews and read everything he had written on the case. So it was hard to hear that from somebody that I had so much respect for. And I asked in my statement, for him to, watch the full film and to review what he said. And he did. He's such a respectable person. He was on BBC afterwards, and they asked him, have you seen the film? Is it accurate? And he said, I have seen the film. And he says, yes, it is historically accurate, but he still felt it should be withdrawn from the Oscars because he just felt it was causing so much distress, which he felt was unnecessary to the family. So, I understand that.
Did you ever at any point think about that?
About withdrawing it?
Yeah, because one thing I wanted to ask you, the other question that I asked you earlier is, like, you're not a guy who's famous, you're not a guy who's in the limelight, you're not a guy who's splashed all over the newspapers, and you're becoming this figure of hate. You're a very confident guy, and you're also, I think, you seem to me to be very independent. You're in yourself. You're kind of, but it can't have not had its toll in terms of.
So I think if I had withdrawn it, I think it would be admitting that there's something wrong with the film, or something, and I wouldn't change anything with the film. Everything in the film is true. If there was something inaccurate or something, or somebody said, it shouldn't be considered for this reason, and therefore, it goes against the eligibility of Oscar consideration, then I would withdraw it. And first of all, I don't know if I had the power to withdraw it. I don't know if I even could have.
Yeah.
But if I had withdrawn it, then people would be saying, well, it shouldn't be shown anywhere. Look, he even withdrew it himself. So it's like saying, you should burn every copy of a book.
So how was your mental health at the time, though? Like, was it? It must have been a very hard time for you to get up in the morning and to
I wasn't getting a lot of sleep, so
right.
no, I was up up from the night before because we were also running a whole Oscar campaign and working with a publicist, but then also trying to deal with what the tabloids were saying, and this petition, people who were asking for it to be withdrawn, and they were outraged about it, but they weren't just asking for the film to be withdrawn from the Oscars. They wanted it to be removed. They wanted to ban it. I couldn't understand why. I mean, there's no violence in the film whatsoever. It doesn't reenact the murder. It just didn't make sense to me. Like,
were you surprised that Hollywood stuck by it?
Given the climate? I mean, even when the tabloids were saying the film is this horrible film and that there's violence in it, I actually wasn't worried because I knew they were watching it. I was like, well, Academy voters can watch it and decide for themselves. And they did. I mean, that was before it was nominated for an Oscar.
Yeah.
This whole controversy happened. So I knew they could watch it, and I trusted them to watch it and make up their own minds.
I mean, perversely, the Ferrari, like any of these things, is, I don't like saying good for the picture, but I mean, it's put it out there, and it's in the conversation, and it's more publicity than a publicist could get for it. I mean, you don't want to look at it in that regard, but in terms of, I mean, you were all over the news for like a period of weeks, and it made you famous.
Certainly, it's probably the most talked about short film ever made. Yeah. Which is something, but for all the wrong reasons.
Yes, yeah.
Unfortunately. And I would like people just to watch it and then form their own opinion.
Yeah.
It's difficult now because people think that that if they show it, broadcasters might not show it because they're afraid that it could be construed as being unsympathetic to the Bulger family. And that's why a lot of the broadsheets wouldn't write about it. So after the Good Morning Britain interview and all the tabloid coverage and Twitter went crazy, my publicist said, I have a journalist from the Times who wants to talk to you, and she came to my hotel the next day with a photographer, and they were going to run this as a feature. And she said to me, she said, Vincent, I've seen your film. Everything that's been reported about it is untrue. She said, there's no violence in your film. And she said she was going to give her own opinion in the piece, but she also wanted to talk to me. I sat there, I talked to her for about 90 minutes, and the photographer did photos, and this was going to run in the Times in London, which I felt was going to speak louder than any of the tabloids.
Yeah.
So I wasn't too worried about what they were saying on the weekend because I knew this was coming out on Monday. Then it wasn't in the paper on Monday, and I checked with my publicist, and I was like, "What? Why isn't it in the paper?" And she says, "Let me check." So she checks in with the journalist, and then comes back to me and says, "Yeah, they're not going to run it." I was like, "What do you mean they're not going to run it?" And she said, "They're burying it." I was like, Are you kidding me? I was like, "Catherine, this is the one thing that can save us." And she said the editor told the journalist that they didn't want to run it because they were worried that it could be construed as being unsympathetic to the Bulger family. And it gave me that sense of just how enormously sensitive this case is when the most respected broadsheet in the country won't run a story they know to be true because they're afraid of getting a backlash from it. And the broadsheets like to blame the tabloids for people having this long-held perspective of just demonizing those boys, calling them evil. But if they don't stand up to the tabloids, then it will never change. That opinion will never change if they don't stand up to it. And then after that, she asked Andrew Pulver from The Guardian, film reviewer, would he do a review of the film? He said, "Yeah, I'd be happy to." And he came back and said, "Sorry, I can't run it," because he had written a favourable review. He was told by his editor, "We can't run that because it could look like we're being unsympathetic to the Bulger family." So he then decided to write it as a news piece where he's taking quotes from the family and quotes from me, and he didn't give his opinion in the piece, which I thought was bizarre. I could not understand why no one would write about it. Everyone was turning it down. People were just afraid to write anything positive about the film. Yeah, it was. It was when the New York Times eventually started writing about it. They wrote a big feature in the New York Times about my film, which was amazing. The headline was, "Why Britain is Outraged About an Oscar-Nominated Short Film." It was so intelligently written, but not taking sides. It was a US journalist who was able to see it and could see why people were afraid to say anything positive about the film in the UK. And it was only after that that broadsheets came in and started writing more nuanced articles. And they've written about the film, and they've given their opinion. The broadsheets have. The tabloids have not changed.
Where is that netted out generally now? I mean, the Ferrari has died down.
Yeah, it's died down, to the point where I almost feel like a normal person again,
And did you get depressed or down, or did you get worried for your safety or anything like that? Did any of that?
Well, it was like a fight, but I always thought, if somebody prints something that isn't true, they'll correct it. That was, naively, I think, I always thought, I just never expected people to just make things up about the film. Nothing can prepare you for that. But I always figured, well, we can turn it around. But at some stage, you have to just stop fighting. Things have been left on, a bad note in terms of the UK tabloid coverage. And a lot of people have formed an opinion about the film, but will never watch it. So that is hard to deal with. But I think if they had just seen the film, it might have made them, just think a little bit more about that case, or want to look into it or research it for themselves.
Isn't it interesting as well the way the books can be made?
So
the books have got all of that in it.
Yeah, I asked David this question. I said, when you wrote your book, because there's nothing in the film which isn't in David's book, but interestingly, the transcripts are also in Ralph's book. There's nothing in Ralph Bulger's book, James's father. There's nothing in the film which isn't in his book either. The thing is, I think people aren't great readers, but they'll watch a film. Or like I said earlier, that it's a drama and not a documentary, it does something different where it, for the first time, it puts the viewer in the room and the viewer feels every moment, every feeling like it's their own. But as human beings, we're conditioned to feel sympathy if we see a child crying.
Yes.
But if that child happens to be
Killer.
Somebody you hate, if that's John Venables and you find yourself actually feeling something for him, that doesn't sit right with people.
No.
Because it goes against everything they've always believed. And even for me, the film is not me expressing my opinion. I would say the film goes against my whole opinion. It challenges my own opinion, and that's how I know it's true.
We're in an outrage culture right now where the deplatforming goes on in American colleges because somebody decides that person shouldn't be speaking. I make the point of, should a Nazi be allowed to go up and speak in front of students in UCD? My view is yes, because I'd like the students in UCD to tear him down and understand exactly what Nazism is, or fascism, or whatever. We have to condition ourselves against hate speech, and we're getting a lot better at that, I think. But when you look at what happened with the tabloid press and the tabloid television, for want of a better word, we could call Good Morning Britain that, and then the burial of news or opinion on someone watching your film and who's a respected journalist, a film critic, it kind of it doesn't augur well for other things in life. You wonder what else. Well, you wonder what else.
I was amazed to see it firsthand. Yeah, and I would never have believed it if I hadn't seen it. People will suppress information like that and won't do. But that's how I was just amazed how enormously sensitive this case is. It's that toxic that they won't print something they know to be true because they're afraid of getting a backlash. I honestly couldn't believe it. And the tabloids have never changed.
You might be interested in this. Somebody once asked me what Rupert Murdoch's business was, in a sentence. The News International, right? News Corp and all that. And you can talk about entertainment, or you can talk about news, or power, or whatever. And this guy said to me, Rupert Murdoch is in business of making things onto which you can put an ad.
Yeah, right.
And
that's
at the end of the day, newspapers are in business to sell copies to people.
Yeah.
And when they sell enough copies to people, advertisers put ads in the newspaper. And people want to read roughly what they believe. They want their own.
Yeah, they give people what they want to hear.
Left-wing papers, right-wing papers. You've got News of the World. You've got Old News, The World, The Sun. And then you have this kind of one-of-a-kind case, which, I mean, the only other one I would put in there is Madeleine McCann. I mean, it's those are the two that just, maybe the Millie Dowler stuff like that, but there's just this, every now and then something comes on, yes, there's always a child involved, yes, something terrible happens, and everyone goes, surely we are not this, and they use words like evil and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And you're in that maelstrom.
Yeah.
You probably don't, that probably wasn't even a question.
Like, no.
You know, it was just kind of observation.
Yeah, it was a strange place to be, you know, to kind of.
How about this before we finish? What would you say to the Bulger family?
Oh, you know, I wrote a letter back to Denise, and I tried to explain the reasons for making the film, and you know that it was never intended to cause them any distress, and you know, I'm really, you know, so sorry that it has, because I've always had so much sympathy for them. I don't feel any animosity towards the Bulger family whatsoever, you know.
And I mean, by the way, I would say, just having someone who's giving you a review of your film, having just watched it 2 hours ago, I thought the Bulger situation was tragic, and it was terrible what happened to him, and there was no sense in that movie that there was any part of it was trying to tell me to be sympathetic to these guys who did this. It was more about just me trying to understand how that could happen, and how they quickly descended back into boys, and how boys possibly, when they're out together, even though they're 10, think they're older and think that they can knock around like adults, and maybe they've had very bad parenting and all this stuff. That's where I went, and I went, a poor kid was a victim in this, and I will always remember that poor kid as the victim. And I think that is what your movie's about.
Well, I mean, I've always, you know, grown up looking at it through, you know, the eyes of the Bulger family, but only through those eyes. Most of the world will just look at it through their eyes, and they're good eyes, you know. I mean, of course, their perspective, you know, will never change, you know, because and I would never expect the Bulger family to see those two boys as anything other than evil monsters. I would never try to change their opinion. If it happened to me, if it happened to you, I would feel exactly the same way. I would never try to change their view on it or their opinion. I do think for the rest of the world that it is important to just take a step back from the case and look at it from a wider point of view, to try and understand why these boys did it, and not just dismiss them as being evil, because if you want to prevent it from happening in the future, the only way you can do it is if you understand the cause of it. And the reason we know their names today is interesting, because I could never understand why the judge decided to release the names. But then I listened to what he said in his reasoning to release their names. It was because he wanted people to look into this case, to examine their backgrounds, so that they can learn from it, so that it never happens again. But that hasn't happened. Instead, it just made them targets, hate figures, and anybody who says any different becomes a hate figure too. Yeah, people haven't learned from the case. They haven't really looked into it. And that was part of the reason I wanted to make the film, so that it could start something, you know. But the first step is to look at them as human beings. The film doesn't have all the answers, and I've never said it does. No. But you know, I think it allows people to ask the right questions.
Has it turned you off filmmaking, or are you more determined than ever to push your career forward?
Definitely, it hasn't turned me off filmmaking.
Okay.
No.
Good. I'm glad.
No, you know, I've always been fascinated by true stories, though, as well, and I'd like to continue to tell true stories. I might pick a slightly less controversial one.
Yes. Anyway, do you know what? Thank you for coming on this.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for coming on this show. I don't mind nailing McCullough to mask. I understand a lot of the outrage on this against you. I also think you've been very brave. I also think you faced it down very well. I also think you are contrite, and I also think your movie's important and very important, and it's exceptionally well made. And thank you for coming on the show and talking to me.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, it was really great chatting with you. Thanks, Phil.